There is a person you know, maybe it's you, who, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation, will suddenly say something like, "Did you know that a day on Venus is longer than its entire year?" Nobody asked. It didn't quite fit. And yet there it was, delivered with this quiet, almost involuntary certainty, like the brain simply couldn't hold it anymore and had to let it out. And the room might laugh, or go quiet for a second, or someone changes the subject, and that person, maybe you, files it away. The mild awkwardness, the sense of having offered something that wasn't quite received, and yet they do it again. Next week, next dinner, next conversation that drifted somewhere unexpected because they can't stop. And more importantly, they don't entirely want to. This video is about those people, not in a way that explains them away, or reduces them to a quirky personality type, or gives them a neat little psychological label to wear on a lanyard, but in a way that actually looks at what's happening underneath. Because what looks like a strange memory quirk on the surface is, when you follow it all the way down, actually a story about how a certain kind of person learned to love the world and why that love took this specific, slightly unusual shape. Let's start with the obvious question, because it's the one most people skip too quickly past. Why these facts? Of all the information that passes through a human mind in a single lifetime, phone numbers, grocery lists, instructions, names, dates, passwords, appointments, why does the brain keep the one about octopuses having 3 hearts and lose the one about where you left your keys 14 seconds ago? If memory worked the way we were taught in school, as a kind of internal filing cabinet, organized by importance or relevance, or how many times a teacher told you it would be on the exam, then none of this would make any sense. A fact about Venus should be nowhere near the front of the drawer. But it's not a filing cabinet. It never was. And that metaphor has quietly done a lot of damage to how people understand their own minds. Your brain stores things based on one primary criterion: how much your nervous system cared in the moment you first encountered them. Not usefulness, not importance, not urgency, emotional charge. That's the whole algorithm. And when you understand that, really understand it, not just intellectually but in your bones, something shifts about what it means to be someone who remembers strange, beautiful, seemingly pointless facts about the world, because it means you are not someone with a quirky memory. You are someone who felt something the first time you heard that the smell of rain has a name, petrichor, coined by 2 scientists in the 1960s, translating roughly to blood of stone. You felt something when you learned that Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the construction of the Great Pyramid. Something moved in you, a small internal tremor, the psychological equivalent of the ground shifting slightly under your feet. And your hippocampus, ancient, unsentimental, doing its job exactly as designed, tagged it, because the brain has always treated unexpectedness as data. The thing that breaks the pattern of your predictions is, evolutionarily speaking, the thing that matters most. You didn't decide to memorize those facts, you just found them delightful, and delight, it turns out, is apparently enough. In 2014, researchers at UC Davis published something that initially seemed almost too strange to be true. When study participants were placed in a state of high curiosity, genuinely engaged, leaning forward, that particular feeling of a question forming that you didn't plan to have, they didn't just remember more about the topic they were curious about, they remembered everything more, faces of strangers shown to them between questions. Unrelated images, information that had nothing to do with whatever had sparked the curiosity in the first place. The curious brain doesn't just open a door. It opens a window, and the light coming through illuminates everything in the room. Now, hold that for a moment, because this is where the psychology starts to get genuinely interesting. Most people treat curiosity as a nice bonus, a pleasant occasional feeling you get when you stumble onto something interesting before your mind drifts back to your to-do list. But there is a subset of people for whom curiosity is not occasional, it's structural, it's almost constitutional. A word they don't recognize becomes an itch they can't leave alone. An offhand statistic that doesn't quite add up becomes a quiet obsession that follows them into the shower. A headline with missing context becomes a thread they will pull until they find the other end. For these people, curiosity isn't something that happens to them sometimes. It's the default setting of their attention. The world, to them, is perpetually slightly ajar, and they are perpetually reaching for the edge of the door. And here is what that actually means in terms of memory. They're not trying to retain information. They're just never really done asking. They're perpetually mid-quest about the world, and the answers keep accumulating almost against their will, stacking up in some internal archive that has no real organizational system except what made them feel something. There's a well-documented personality dimension in psychology called openness to experience. And people who score high on it don't just tolerate novelty, they find it genuinely rewarding. Not in a polite, socially acceptable, oh how interesting kind of way. In a neurologically measurable way. The dopamine response to encountering something genuinely unexpected is real. It's not a metaphor. It's not something people say to sound engaging at dinner parties. The reward circuit actually fires. And for high-openness individuals, it fires more readily, more consistently, and for smaller stimuli than average. A strange fact about deep-sea fish, a coincidence in historical dates, a word etymology that reframes something they thought they understood. These are not trivial pleasures. These are, in a very real neurological sense, rewards. But here's the piece I want you to sit with for a moment, because I think this is the part that most people, including the people this video is about, have never quite consciously registered. Go back through your own private catalog of trivia. The things you know that no one has ever needed you to know. The obscure historical footnotes, the strange animal behaviors, the mathematical coincidences that made you go, wait, actually? There's probably a shape to it, even if it doesn't look like one at first. Most of it, when you look closely, clusters around a very specific feeling. Not just interest, not just surprise, something closer to scale, the feeling of the world being briefly larger than you thought it was. That's what these facts are underneath the surface. They are not random, they are residue, little traces of moments where reality exceeded your expectations of it. Fault lines where the ordinary, predictable surface of everyday life cracked open slightly and showed you something underneath, something stranger, more intricate, more alive than the world presents itself, as on a normal Wednesday afternoon. The fact about the shuffled deck of cards, that there are more possible arrangements of a standard deck than there are atoms on Earth, doesn't just tell you something about combinatorics. It briefly dissolves the scale of things you thought you understood. It makes the world feel different for a moment. Larger, stranger, more. And the person who keeps that fact isn't keeping it because it's useful. They're keeping it because that feeling, that exact feeling, meant something to them. Means something still. We live in a culture obsessed with optimization, with usefulness, with turning every thought into a productivity outcome, and every piece of information into a tool that either builds the career or gets thrown away. And in that framework, people who remember strange, beautiful, useless, facts get quietly filed under charming, but inefficient. Likeable, perhaps, functional at trivia nights, but not quite serious, not quite focused. But what if we've been looking at it entirely backwards? What if the person who can't stop collecting strange truths about the world isn't someone who failed to prioritize correctly, but someone who never lost the thing that most adults quietly misplace? Somewhere around the age of 14, because there's a grief when you think about it in the child who stopped asking but why though, not because they found the answers, but because somewhere along the way they received the message clearly enough, often enough, that the question itself was inconvenient. Too much, taking up too much space, not the kind of thing serious people spend their time on. And then there are the others. The ones who kept asking anyway, who carried the questions forward into adulthood, slightly apologetically sometimes, slightly louder than the room expected, occasionally at dinner tables when someone had asked about weekend plans. And here's what I want to understand, not just about the facts, but about the people who keep them. Because there's something underneath the trivia that I don't think gets examined nearly enough. What I want to understand is this: why does the world feel personal to them? Because it does. For people who carry these facts, the world isn't a backdrop. It's a conversation. Every strange truth they've ever collected is, in some quiet way, a reply to a question they didn't know they were asking. And that relationship between a curious mind and an endlessly strange universe is not a quirk. It is, arguably, one of the most honest ways a human being can move through their life. There is something almost tender about it when you see it clearly. These people were never collecting facts. They were collecting moments, tiny private instances where the world exceeded itself, where reality briefly showed its stranger, more beautiful underside. And they held on to them, not to impress anyone, not to win arguments, but because letting go of them felt like letting go of the feeling itself. Like closing a door on something luminous, and maybe that's the reframe worth carrying forward. Not, why do I remember useless things? But rather, what does it mean that these are the things I chose to keep? Because your memory is, in a very real sense, a self-portrait. The facts that stayed are the ones that once made you feel most alive, most genuinely present, most like yourself. That is not a malfunction, that is a map. So if you are the person at the table who just mentioned, unprompted, that a shrimp's heart is in its head, this is for you. You are not broken. You are not failing to be practical. You are someone whose mind never stopped treating the world as worth paying attention to. And in a world that moves fast and rewards the useful and forgets the beautiful, that is not a small thing. That is, perhaps, everything. If something in this video made you feel quietly seen, you are not alone. There are more of us than you think. Subscribe, and let's keep looking at this strange, fascinating world together.